I was pretty young when I went camping with my dad in Alabama. Late at night, as the embers of the fire were dying down and we were about to go to sleep, we heard a bone-chilling moan coming from the woods. We looked at each other and decided it was probably just trees rubbing together. But then it happened 2 more times. My dad grabbed the flashlight, and I followed behind him with a big stick, determined to protect him if something went wrong. Eventually, we discovered a woman lying on the ground not far from our campsite. She was on a hill, head facing down and feet uphill, continuing to moan. It turned out she had drunk so much that she could hardly talk. She had been camping in the woods with her boyfriend, but after a big fight, he drove away, leaving her alone. She had seen our fire dying and wanted to give us the rest of her firewood before she left too. But she had tripped and was too drunk to get up. We got her back to her campsite and made sure she wasn't driving anywhere that night. I'll never forget that moaning sound though. I was camping once in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, in a pretty secluded spot with distinct individual campsites. It was fall, so dead leaves covered the ground. As we settled in to sleep, we started to hear slow, consistent footsteps on the leaves. The sounds circled our campsite and our tent, moving around without any clear goal and never stopping. We assumed it was some kind of animal, but when we rushed out with a light, there was nothing, no sound, no trace of anything. Once we were back in the tent, the footsteps immediately started again, right next to us. We repeated this whole rigmarole probably 3 more times because of how distinct, close, and creepy those footsteps were, but we never caught even a glimpse of what was walking around. The next morning, while sitting by the fire, we started hearing the steps again. We looked down and realized it was the sound of multiple small frogs hopping around the campsite. The first time I went camping, I was with my wife and our dog in a tent where the upper half was mesh and see-through. Around sunrise, I woke up to my dog growling at something. I leaned forward to check and saw a bear cub walking through our campsite. The scary part was that I didn't want my dog's growling to attract the cub's mother, so I pinned my dog on the bed and held his mouth shut to keep him quiet until the bear left. My heart was beating out of my chest the whole time. Later, I found out that the bear was an orphan, friendly to humans, and survived by stealing food from garbage and campsites. I used to camp at this fairly secluded spot on state land. Unfortunately, it has since been discovered and become popular. I've been going there since I was a kid, and it had become an annual tradition for my buddies and me to unplug and rough it for a few days. Back then, a little over 15 years ago, it was relatively unknown, and getting to the campsite was a bit of a trek. It was in the middle of the woods but close to a lake, perfect for swimming. There was no cell signal, no light pollution, just pure wilderness. My buddies and I were always excited to spend a week there every summer. One summer afternoon, I was the first to arrive, ready for a week of camping, drinking, and swimming. To my dismay, I discovered that the site already had an established campsite with a couple of tents set up. Since it was a large campsite, I decided to haul my gear over and see if I could talk to the other campers about sharing the spot. Who knows, they might be cool and maybe it could turn into one big party. I walked up to the site and found no people. The tents were empty, but there was evidence of a recent campfire, so I knew people had been there not too long ago. I decided to check the lake, thinking they might have gone swimming. There was a steep path from the site to the lake, and as I walked alongside it, I discovered debris blown down along the path. There was a sleeping bag, some tools and clothes that had fallen into the dirt. All signs indicated that the site had been set up for a while. The clothes were wet with ditch water, and they had clearly been sitting on the ground for some time. When I returned to the campsite, I realized it had been abandoned for quite a while, but that didn't explain why everything had been left behind. From what I could tell, the campers had left in a big hurry. There were clothes, food, and other gear scattered around. Everything you wouldn't leave unless you were scrambling to grab the essentials. The fire was out, but there was still ice in their coolers and beers, so it couldn't have been too long ago that they were there. When my buddies arrived, we decided to set up camp nearby and keep an eye on the abandoned site, thinking maybe the people had to leave for an emergency. We ended up camping out the whole week, but no one ever came back to retrieve their stuff. Luckily, the DNR happened to stop by on patrol, and we told them about our discovery. They said they'd pack up the stuff and take it to a lost and found at their station. It was kind of creepy and mostly weird. Who knows what happened to those people? When I was a kid, probably around 11 or 13, my best friend's grandparents lived on a farm, about 100 acres of forest with a few clearings and a house. We used to camp out there all the time. One night, a few of us were camping and heard repeated thumps and screaming coming from the trees. We had just finished reading a book about Bigfoot in school and were convinced Bigfoot was out in the woods, hitting trees and roaring. Terrified but curious, we got out of the tent and walked through the woods toward the noise. Note: people really do this kind of dumb thing. It's not just in horror movies. Eventually, we came to a clearing and found several of my friend's uncles trying to fix an old barn. They were absolutely shit-faced at 2 a.m. in the morning. The thumps were the sound of them hitting wood with hammers, and the screams were from when they missed and hit themselves because of the alcohol. We were terrified at the time, but now it's hilarious. 10 years ago, I went camping for a weekend. On the morning of the second day, we went hiking and soon found ourselves off-trail on a steep incline along the Monashi River, about 100 feet up. Suddenly, one of my friends lost his footing and started to slide. On the way down, he took out another friend, and I watched them hit every rock and tree on their way down to the rapids. I climbed down to find one friend dead on the side of the river and the other swept away by the current. His body was found 2 weeks later, 2 kilometers from where they fell in. When search and rescue tried to remove his body from the logjam it was stuck in, boulders on the riverbank came loose and collapsed on top of his corpse. His body, or whatever is left of it, is still there. This is a very abbreviated version of the story, but it was an incredibly scary day. I'm pretty sure 2 guys were planning to harm my friend and me. We were teenagers, 16 and 18, and had gone camping alone. We made dinner and were having a good time in the evening when a man passed by our site near the river. He had a fishing pole, so we didn't think much of it. He asked to cut through our site to get to the road, and we naively agreed. He stopped and looked around our site, asking questions like, "How old are you? Where are you from? How long are you staying?" Typical questions that were none of his business, but we answered them anyway. Eventually, he left and headed down the canyon on the road. A couple of hours later, he returned with a buddy. Both of these guys were middle-aged, probably in their mid-40s. They started asking more questions. The original guy snooped around our campsite, and we got an uneasy feeling. We were super grateful when they eventually left, but instead of going back the way they came, they went further up the canyon. A couple more hours passed, and it was dark. My friend mentioned how the noise from the river made it hard to hear anything else, which made her anxious. We talked and realized we had both been on edge since the guys left. We hadn't seen them go back down the canyon. We both had a gut feeling that we needed to leave and fast. Maybe nothing would have happened, but we both felt it. The guys had asked all the right questions to know we were alone and defenseless that night. I went to Guatemala with my girlfriend and we did a 3-day hike through the jungle to Tikal. We slept in a tent at 2 tiny ranger campsites deep in the woods. During the second night, a massive thunderstorm was raging above us. At 4 a.m., I woke up to the sound of male voices and left the tent to check them out. 2 guys with rifles approached me. I told my girlfriend to stay in the tent because it was scary, but she didn't comply and joined me. It turned out the guys were local hunters looking for shelter in the camp. We offered them coffee, which they were more than happy to accept. About 30 seconds later, the storm intensified, and a massive tree crashed onto our tent. If I hadn't left to check out the guys, or if my girlfriend had stayed in the tent, we would both be dead now. In college, I did a lot of solo car camping from the back of my truck. I owned at the time, and one time I went to a remote public area in the Ozarks and planned to stay overnight. After setting up all my bedding and having dinner and a sugary dessert, I decided to hunker down for the night. About 45 minutes after turning off the light, I started hearing leaves crunching in the woods about 30 yards away. Not really concerned, I wrote it off as an opossum, deer, coyote, or something similar just moving through the area. However, my imagination started going wild, as it always does, and I began thinking of the worst situations. More leaves crunching, but this time closer, definitely in the campsite. I usually carry a can of bear spray, but being a bit foolish, I didn't think about the fact that I was in an enclosed space until I was ready to use it. More crunching leaves, but then they started to fade away. I started to relax a little as they eventually disappeared. With my nerves completely racked, I tried to go to sleep. At some point, I must have fallen into a really light sleep because I woke up about 2 to 3 hours later. It was about 2 in the morning, and there was very obviously something walking between me and the campfire. Then, from inside my truck camper, a deep, loud, and incredibly scary voice asked, "Do you believe in God?" I freaked out, screaming and turning on headlamps, thrashing about, getting ready to defend myself. The footsteps ran away and disappeared into the woods as I went into full panic mode. I had to tell myself I hallucinated the whole thing because of the sugary dessert I ate before bed. To this day, it still gets my heart racing when I think about it too much. Just 2 weeks ago, I was having dinner with a buddy on a mountainside in Denali National Park. Suddenly, we heard the sound of rocks tumbling down from the steep hillside above us, and my first thought was, "Oh shit, landslide." I turned to look, and about 10 feet away, 5 caribou, including 2 babies, were sprinting down the hillside next to us. I heard more rocks tumbling, and close behind them, only about 20 feet from me, a wolf was chasing them down the mountain. When it saw us, the wolf stopped next to us and stared for a second before running back up the hill to a little outcropping of rock about 60 feet away. It stood there, staring at us for a good half-minute, took a few steps towards us, then ran away. We knew there was a wolf den in the area, but wolf encounters are rare in Denali National Park, and I never would have wished to see one so close. I wasn't really afraid for my life since there were 2 of us and only 1 of him, but it was a very wild experience, and my legs were definitely shaking. Hiking a trail in East Tennessee, I hadn't seen a soul since leaving the parking lot that morning. As the sun set, I made camp on top of a rock bluff about 50 yards off the trail. After a quick dinner, I was probably asleep by 7 p.m. Around 11 p.m., I woke up to the sound of voices, which sounded like muttered German. I listened for a few minutes and could hear footsteps and the voices coming toward the tent. I woke up my hiking partner, who heard the same thing. The footsteps stopped, what seemed like 10 feet from the tent, and the same 2 mumbling voices continued. I unzipped the tent and looked out, but there was nothing. I grabbed my flashlight, shone it around. Nothing. After a few minutes, I got back in the tent, and we both tried to sleep. But after a few minutes, the voices started up again, along with what sounded like someone cutting a tree with an axe. My partner pulled on his boots, and we both agreed the sound was 10 feet away to the right of the tent. He unzipped the tent slowly, we still heard sounds, and he jumped outside with his flashlight, heading in that direction. Still nothing. We sat outside the tent for over an hour because there was no way we were going to sleep, but we heard nothing. Eventually, we were both about to pass out, so we went back in the tent and fell asleep. Around 3:30 a.m., the axe sound started again, and we both just lay there listening. A few minutes later, we heard the cracking and whooshing sound of a falling tree and felt the thud as it hit the ground. We both jumped up and scrambled out of the tent, but there was nothing. No sound at all. No wind whistling through the trees, just silence. We packed up everything in minutes but decided not to leave because the climb back down to the trail was difficult in daylight and too risky in the dark. We sat there until the sun came up without hearing the voices or axe again. We calmed down somewhat by that point and started searching the area. We probably went 100 yards in every direction from our camp, but there was no sign anyone had been there, and certainly no large, recently fallen tree. About 20 years ago in Pisgah National Forest, I was camping in a hammock for the first time. I didn't have a rain tarp yet, leaving myself completely uncovered save for a sleeping bag. Now, this was a trip from a summer camp in the area, so there were about 6 other teens with me. One kid decided, "Hey, Chocolate, "That's not smellable, right?" and left the chocolate in his pack, right next to mine, under the hammock. You may see where this is going. Lo and behold, around midnight, a juvenile black bear moseys his way into our campsite looking for that sweet, sweet chocolate. As he was messing with the packs underneath the hammock, his back kept bumping into me. I was starting to wake up, but I was very groggy. I kind of thought it was the kid looking for something in his pack. The bear realizes that the hammock is moving and gives it a bat with his paw, like a cat with yarn, swinging me. At this point, I realize this is not a camper and start screaming. The rest of the campsite woke up, and we threw rocks at the bear until it ran away. The kid got a severe punishment. Camping in the San Juan Mountains of southwest Colorado last summer was an experience like no other. We had been going almost every year, but the weather that particular year was beyond anything we had ever encountered. Monsoon season is typical for us, but last year, the rain started and just didn't stop. For 5 days straight, we camped in constant rain, with landslides occurring all around us. Each day brought new challenges as we found ourselves completely blocked from leaving camp in various directions. The route to the closest town was cut off, making it several hours away. The effects of a harsh avalanche winter and previous wildfires had cleared swaths of trees, leaving bare ground that was easily washed away by the relentless rains. On our last day of camping, as we were packing up, we heard the increasingly familiar sound of a landslide starting. This time, however, it was accompanied by the most terrifying, blood-curdling scream I had ever heard in my life. I have no doubt that I heard someone die that morning from across the valley. We immediately packed up and hurried down the mountain, seeking help from someone with an ATV and radio. As we made our way east on I-70 towards home, we narrowly missed the Glenwood Canyon landslide by about 45 minutes. This landslide was so powerful that it changed the course of the Colorado River and completely washed away the highway. That trip taught me a valuable lesson about respecting the power of Mother Nature. Her forces are unpredictable and unforgiving, and we must always be prepared to face them with caution and respect. Although I wasn't as frightened as I should have been, my fear gene is a bit broken, and I had been drinking. We live near a lake, and my daughter's friend had never been camping, so we decided to do a quick overnight trip there. We enjoy camping and seek out remote spots. No official campsites, just finding a secluded spot. We found a nice little peninsula that could fit about 3 campsites. It was Sunday, and we hoped the other 2 groups would leave. Eventually, they did, and we had the place to ourselves. As the night went on, we had a great time by the fire, singing, laughing, drinking wine, and making s'mores. Everything was perfect until we went to sleep. About an hour later, the girls woke me up because it was raining, and we needed to cover the tent. It was a huge tent, so all hands were needed. The wind was blowing, and we struggled, but we finally got it covered and went back to sleep, until a motorcycle, a dirt bike specifically, appeared around 2 a.m. It was riding circles around the peninsula. Keep in mind, this area was small enough for only 3 large tents and 3 cars, with nothing else nearby but bushes and the lake. There was no reason for anyone else to be there. It was obvious we were alone. The dirt bike kept going up, down, around, then stopping. This went on for almost an hour. The engine never stopped. Frustrated, I went to the front of the tent and unzipped it. I looked outside and saw the rider staring. I climbed out of the tent and stared back, unable to tell if the person could see me in the darkness. I went back into the tent, feeling frustrated. The girls were frightened, and when I told them what was happening, they demanded that I stay inside. I settled back in and waited. The dirt bike continued its circles, revving the engine, stopping, and then continuing. This went on for another hour. I had enough. I was about to confront the rider when I felt a chill run down my spine. The rider was facing directly toward our tent, saying nothing, just staring. Realizing I had no weapons and no way to protect the girls, and with the rider between us and the car, I hesitated. Instinct and logic told me that an aggressive approach was probably the wrong move. I stayed stock still, just like the rider, for what felt like an eternity. We stared at each other for what must have been 20 minutes. Then, suddenly, the rider took off, driving off the peninsula and out of earshot, never to return. To this day, I'll never know what that was about or if I did the right thing. I'm just glad I never confronted the rider. My gut told me not to. As for my daughter and me, I think I need to consider buying a gun if we're going to camp alone like this.